My son took my 12 million Palm Beach villa and gave it to his wife's family. This is theirs now. Don't ever show your face here, his wife laughed. You belong in a nursing home, not a palace. I smiled and nodded. When her family arrived with 3 moving trucks, the surprise waiting inside made her drop the keys. My name is Barrett. I'm 69 years old, and everything I'm about to tell you happened over the last 3 years, though the roots of it go back much further than that. Back to a version of me who thought that if he just worked hard enough for long enough, he could buy his way out of every mistake he'd ever made. I didn't inherit a dime. My father drove a delivery route for a regional bakery, and my mother kept the books for 2 dentist offices, and between them, we were fine, comfortable. But nobody in my family had ever owned anything that needed insuring. I went to a state college on a partial scholarship and worked nights loading trucks to cover the rest. When I graduated, I went into commercial flooring and tile distribution, unglamorous as it gets, and I loved it anyway. There was something clean about it. You sold a product, it either performed or it didn't, and the math never lied to you the way people sometimes do. I spent 12 years working for other men before I mortgaged everything I owned and bought out a failing distributor 2 counties over. I turned it into something real over the next 32 years, not a household name, but by the time I sold it, we were moving product across 5 states with 400 and some employees who depended on me to keep making good decisions. I sold that business at 63. That is where the money came from. All of it, distilled into a single signature on a hot Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's conference room. And with that money, I bought the house in Palm Beach. I need to tell you about my wife before I tell you about the house, because the house doesn't make sense without her, and neither does anything that came after. Her name was Eleanor. We were married for 39 years. She grew up outside Dayton, Ohio, in a house with aluminum siding and a carport that never quite kept the rain off the car, and when she was 19, she tore a photograph out of a magazine in a waiting room. A white house, palm trees, a pool the color of something you'd only ever seen in a postcard. She folded that photograph into quarters and kept it in a drawer for the next 4 decades, through every lean year, through the 7 years I was on the road 200 nights a season, through raising a son mostly alone while I chased invoices in 3 states. She never once asked me for that house, not one time in 39 years. I didn't understand the size of that restraint myself until much later. She would take that photograph out sometimes, usually in February, on the kind of gray afternoon when the furnace was working too hard and the windows sweated on the inside, and she'd look at it for a minute, then fold it back up and put it away. I used to think that was patience. I've had a lot of time to reconsider what it actually was. I think somewhere around year 15, she quietly worked out that she had married a man who was going to be somewhere else for most of the years she had left, and that photograph was how she kept a version of the future alive where all of it had still been worth it. So when the money finally came, I bought her the house from the picture, near enough to it that it didn't matter. 11 bedrooms, more than we would ever need, a pool that looked straight out at the water, palm trees exactly like the ones in a photograph that had gone soft as cloth from 4 decades of being folded and unfolded in a kitchen drawer in 3 different houses. I still have that photograph in a box in the guest house, along with some other things of hers that nobody else in this story thought were worth keeping. Here is the part I have had the hardest time forgiving myself for. I bought that house too late. Eleanor was already sick when we closed on it. We didn't know yet, not officially, but I think some part of her already did, because she'd been saying things in those last weeks that only make sense to me now as a woman quietly saying goodbye to things. We found out for certain about 6 weeks after we moved in. She got 14 months in that house. Some of those months were good, most of them were not. And in the spring, she died in the upstairs bedroom, in the house from the photograph, with the water visible through the window if you turned your head the right way. And I sat on the edge of that bed for a very long time afterward, understanding something far too late to do a single thing about it. What I understood was this: I had spent 32 years of my life buying a woman a house, when what she had actually wanted the whole time, every single year of it, was a husband who came home. There was one specific stretch of those 14 months worth telling in full, because it is the reason this entire story ends the way it does, and none of what I did later makes any sense without it. There was a run of about 5 weeks in the second spring where Eleanor felt, by some grace I never understood and never questioned, genuinely well. Not cured. We both knew better than to use that word. But well enough to sit up, well enough to want coffee, well enough to ask me one morning to carry a chair down to the seawall at the bottom of the lawn so she could watch the water while it was still cool out. I carried that chair down every single morning for 5 weeks. Rain or shine, before the heat came up off the grass, I carried a folding chair to the seawall, and she sat in it with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and she watched the water, and I stood next to her, and neither of us said very much, because there wasn't very much left that needed saying. On the 3rd morning of that stretch, she looked up at me and said, "Barrett, this is the most time you've spent in one place since 1987, and she was laughing when she said it, which somehow made it worse, because I understood immediately that she was right, and that both of us knew exactly what that had cost us to arrive at this particular truth on a beautiful morning by the water we'd waited 30 years to see together. I gave that woman 32 years of building something and 5 weeks of chairs. That arithmetic has followed me every day since, and it is the entire reason I am telling this story now, because everything I did afterward, every decision rejection, every silence, every certified letter came directly out of those 5 weeks and what they taught me, far too late, about what a house is actually for. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in the upstairs bedroom. I was holding her hand. Some things belong only to the people who were in the room, and I've decided that mourning is one of them. I was 65 years old, and I was alone in a house with 11 bedrooms, most of which I had never once set foot in, and I did not handle it well. The version of this story where I was a wise, composed old man from the beginning isn't the true one. I wandered that house at 3 in the morning like it owed me an explanation. I ate standing up over the kitchen sink because sitting down at the table alone felt like something I hadn't earned yet. Our housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, who had been coming to that house twice a week since before we moved to Palm Beach, would arrive on Mondays and find the exact same plate in the exact same spot on the counter because I had stopped noticing whether I'd already eaten that day. Rosa is going to matter later in this story, and I want you to remember her name because almost nobody else in this house ever bothered to. It was into that grief, into that particular kind of drowning that doesn't look like drowning from the outside because the man doing it still shows up clean-shaven and pays his bills on time, that my son said the 4 words that started everything. He said, "Dad, why don't we move in? Just for a while. You shouldn't be alone in here." And I said yes. I think there are people listening to this who have said yes to something similar, and I don't want you to think I believe we were foolish for it. We were lonely, and loneliness makes a man generous in ways that people doing careful arithmetic in the next room can make very good use of. For about 6 months, it was genuinely good. There was noise in the house again. There was someone else's coffee cup left in the sink, which I discovered I didn't mind at all, and there was a baby on the way, my granddaughter, and for those 6 months, I let myself believe this was simply what the next chapter of my life looked like. An old man with more house than he needed, and a family filling it back up. Then it began to turn, so slowly that I genuinely cannot point to the single day it happened, which I've come to think is the most important detail in this entire story. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to take an old man's house out from under him. It happens one small permission at a time, and every single one of those permissions feels, in the moment you grant it, like the reasonable thing to do. The first thing was my study. I'd had an office on the ground floor since the week we moved in. My desk, my late father's old drafting table that I'd kept for 40 years for no reason, except that it had been his. My daughter-in-law wanted to convert it into a nursery, and I understood the logic instantly, because a baby needs a room near the parents. So I said fine, and I watched 2 movers carry my father's drafting table out to the garage, where it sat under a moving blanket for the next 2 years, and I told myself it didn't matter because it was just furniture, and furniture doesn't grieve. Then it was Eleanor's art. She had picked every piece in that house herself, walking through galleries in a wheelchair some days, insisting on seeing everything in person, even when it clearly exhausted her, because she said a house should only have things in it that you chose while you were still capable of choosing. Over about a year, most of those pieces came down. One here, one there, always with a reasonable sounding explanation. The light in this room doesn't suit it. Don't you think this wall could use something warmer? Each removal was small enough that objecting would have made me the difficult one, clinging to paint on canvas while his dead wife's memory prevented his living family from making a home for themselves. So I said nothing each time, and somewhere around the 40th or 50th painting, the house stopped looking like Eleanor's house. It looked like a house Eleanor had never been inside of. There was one particular afternoon I've turned over in my mind more than any other. I came into the kitchen, and my daughter-in-law had a woman with her, an interior designer. Fabric swatches fanned out across the island. I said something friendly about the colors, trying to be a good and easy presence in a house that was rapidly stopping being mine in any way except the deed. The designer turned to me and said, "Oh, are you the father-in-law? It's so nice you're able to stay with them." Stay with them. My daughter-in-law did not correct her. She let it sit there in the air between us, this small, precise redefinition of who owned what, and then she said, "Barrett, we're almost finished in here. Do you mind? In my kitchen." And I said, "No, of course not." And I took my coffee and went out to sit by the pool, like a house guest being asked politely to give the family some privacy in their own home. Here is the mechanism, as best I understand it now. It is never one large theft. It is 40 small ones, each small enough that objecting to it would make you the unreasonable party. And every time saying something costs more than staying quiet does. Then one day you look up from your coffee by a pool that used to be yours and realize you are living in the back of your own life. Then came the guest house. They came to me together, which they always did when the thing they were about to propose needed a united front. My son did most of the talking, the way he always did when he wanted something to sound like it had been his own idea. With the baby coming, they said, it made more sense for me to take the guest house at the back. More privacy for me. Quieter. Better for everybody once you thought it through. The guest house is genuinely very nice. It's nicer than any place I lived until I was 50. The point is that I moved out of the main house I had bought for my dying wife into a smaller building at the back of my own property at 66 years old and told myself the entire time it had been my own idea because that was easier to live with. Once I was out there, something shifted that I didn't fully understand until much later. I stopped being consulted about anything at all. Contractors would show up at the main house and I would walk over out of simple curiosity about what was happening to a property I still legally owned every square inch of, and I would be told told, pleasantly, cheerfully, that it was handled. My son started referring to the main house as our place, first only to me, then in front of guests, and then eventually, without even the small courtesy of catching himself, in front of me as though I weren't standing right there. I want to be precise about something now, since it is the legal spine this entire story eventually hangs on. That property was mine, solely, entirely. There was never a moment when it was anything other than that. My name, and only my name, was on the deed. Purchased outright with a wire transfer from the sale of a business I had spent 32 years building. No mortgage, no trust, no partnership of any kind. I had never signed one document giving my son any legal interest in that property. He simply began behaving as though it were his, and because nobody corrected him for 2 straight years, he stopped experiencing it as a question at all. That is how confidence works when nobody ever tells you no. It stops feeling like an assumption and starts feeling like a fact. A particular loneliness comes from living in the back of a property you own outright, while a family you love treats you as a guest in it. It's quieter than regular loneliness. It doesn't announce itself. You still see your family at dinner. You still hold your granddaughter on Sunday afternoons. But you have stopped being a person anyone consults and started being a person things are arranged around, the way you arrange a piece of furniture that's inconvenient to move but not worth throwing away yet. My granddaughter deserves a moment here because she is the one person in this entire story completely innocent of everything that happened, and I don't want the weight of what her parents did to ever fall near her. She was born about 4 months after we moved into the guest house, and she is, without reservation, the best thing that came out of any of it. I held her the day she was born. None of what follows is about her, and I want that said plainly before we go any further. I told you I would come back to Rosa, because what happened to her made the shape of my son and daughter-in-law's character clear to me in a way that no amount of study conversions or gallery removals ever quite managed on their own. Rosa had cleaned our house for 22 years, going back to the smaller place we owned before Palm Beach. She was there through every year of Eleanor's illness. She sat with my wife on the afternoons I could not stand to be in the room, and she never once said a word about it to anyone in all the years since. I have never found a way to properly thank her for that. When my son and daughter-in-law moved in, Rosa's hours got cut almost immediately, a day here, a day there, always with some reasonable-sounding explanation about efficiency. Then, about 8 months in, my daughter-in-law let her go entirely, by text message. After 22 years, no severance, no notice, because she'd found a cleaning service she preferred. I found out 3 days later, because Rosa herself called me, not to complain, but because she was worried whether I was doing all right, whether anyone was looking after the guest house now that she wasn't coming anymore. After being fired by text message, the thing she thought to do was call and make sure I was okay. Honestly, that phone call clarified things more than the study, or the art, or the guest house, or any of the small humiliations I'd absorbed on my own behalf. I could rationalize almost anything happening to me. I did not have a single available excuse for what had happened to Rosa. There was no version where I could tell myself it was fine, and so I couldn't perform my usual trick of talking myself out of being upset about it. I didn't act on any of it yet. I didn't call a lawyer that week, or the week after, but Rosa's phone call is where the first real crack opened in whatever I had been telling myself about my son still being underneath everything. The boy who used to bring me things he'd made in school and wait patiently for me to notice him. There's a night in March I have to describe because it is the night everything actually changed, even though I didn't do anything about it for several more weeks. It was a Thursday. I'd walked up to the main house around 9 to pull a book off a shelf in what used to be my study, and I let myself in through the kitchen door out of old habit since I no longer had a key to the front. I heard voices in the dining room before I saw anyone. My son and his wife, a bottle of wine open on the table, her parents on speakerphone. I stopped in the dark of that kitchen, and I listened to my son and my daughter-in-law plan the rest of my life without me in the room. Harold and June were in the process of selling their own place further north, and the plan was already well along. They were discussing which bedrooms would go to whom. Harold and June would take the front rooms, the ones that had been mine and Eleanor's, the ones with the water view. Then, her mother's voice tinny through the speaker, asking a question so casual it might have been about a piece of furniture. "And what about Barrett?" My daughter-in-law's answer came fast, like she'd rehearsed it. "He's happy in the back. Long term, there are some really nice places down here, somewhere with people his own age." My son said, "Yeah, probably a year or two. Probably a year or two." I stood in that dark kitchen at 68 years old and listened to my son and his wife discuss, in the exact tone you'd use to plan a kitchen renovation, which facility they intended to eventually place me in, inside the house I had built with 32 years of my own labor, while Eleanor's paintings sat boxed up in a storage unit in Riviera Beach. I felt something in that moment that surprised me more than anything else in this entire story. It was not rage. What I felt instead was the cleanest, quietest kind of clarity I have ever experienced, like someone had finally switched a light on in a room I had been feeling my way around blind for 3 straight years. Standing in the dark, holding a book I no longer remember the title of, I finally let myself understand something I had been refusing to understand since Eleanor died. My son was not going to become a different person. I had been waiting for that, quietly, for 3 years, and probably for 20 years before that, waiting for the boy underneath to surface and take the wheel back from whoever this other version had become. become. He was not a phase. He was who my money and my absence had actually made him. Over 39 years of me being somewhere else while he grew up. I got my book. I walked back to the guest house in the dark. I did not say a single word to anyone. And the next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, I called a lawyer. The attorney I called was a woman named Diane Castellan, who specialized in estate and elder law, recommended by the man who had handled the sale of my business years earlier. That detail turned out to matter enormously. Do not use the lawyer your family already knows. Find someone with no thread connecting them to the people you're protecting yourself from, because that distance is what keeps the process honest. I sat in Diane's office on a Friday morning, and I told her the entire story, start to finish. She listened without interrupting me once, which I noticed and appreciated more than I expected to, since I had grown so accustomed to being managed through conversations, rather than simply heard in them. When I finished, she asked me a question that nobody had asked me in 3 years, and it stopped me completely. "Barrett," she said, "what do you actually want?" I sat there and could not answer her. When you have spent 3 years being managed, one quiet concession after another, you eventually stop generating wants of your own altogether. It doesn't feel like losing something. It feels like being agreeable. But underneath that agreeableness, you have quietly stopped asking what you actually want out of your own remaining life, since the answer has never once changed anything. Diane let the silence sit for a good long while, which I've since learned is a rarer skill in a lawyer than you'd expect. Then she tried a different question. All right, different question. If that house disappeared tomorrow, just gone, completely gone, what would you actually miss about it? And I said, nothing. I heard myself say it and understood it was completely true. There was nothing in that 11,000 square foot building I actually wanted anymore. Eleanor wasn't in it. Her paintings weren't even in it. Not the ones quietly taken down over a year and boxed up 2 towns over. It was 11,000 square feet of someone else's idea of a life, wearing my name on the deed like a costume that no longer fit the man wearing it. Diane looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Then let's talk about what it could actually do instead." I want to walk through what I did next carefully, because it's the part of this story people most often misunderstand, and because it is completely legal, completely documented, and frankly, completely boring, which is exactly why it worked. There was no scheme. A man who solely and legally owns a piece of real property is allowed to give that property away to whomever he wishes, and I decided, sitting in that office, that I was going to give mine away. Diane knew of a foundation working in exactly the gap I needed filled, and before I made any final decision, she drove me out to see the facility they were currently working with, so I'd understand precisely what I was choosing before I chose it. There is a real and quiet crisis in this country involving old people who have money on paper, but no one left who actually wants them in a room, and a second one involving families caring for aging parents who are being financially and physically destroyed by it, because respite care, the kind that lets an exhausted daughter put her mother somewhere decent for 2 weeks and finally sleep, is either unaffordable or simply doesn't exist. What the foundation desperately needed, and could not afford anywhere in that county, was a large residential property that could serve as both a respite facility and a transitional home. We drove out to see it, a converted ranch house set back off a 6-lane road with 8 beds crammed into a space never designed to hold that many people, and a waiting list, the director told me, 91 names long. She apologized 3 separate times for the air conditioning, audibly straining behind a closet door the entire time we spoke. I stood in that hallway and thought about 11 bedrooms sitting almost entirely empty in Palm Beach, a pool nobody but my granddaughter and her friends ever swam in, a guest wing unused for 2 straight years, while a woman on the phone behind me told somebody there was nothing available until possibly November. That was the entire decision. It took about 4 seconds, and I have never once looked back on it since. So I decided to give them a $12 million villa in Palm Beach with 11 bedrooms, a pool, and a view of the water that had cost me 32 years to earn the right to buy. I put exactly one condition on the gift, and only one. The building had to carry Eleanor's name. She had wanted that house her entire life, ever since she was a teenage girl in Ohio, dreaming over a picture she'd clipped from somewhere she couldn't remember years later. 14 months in it, most of them not good, but her name is on the front of that building now, permanently, in bronze, and there are going to be people in those rooms for the next 50 years, looking out at that same water, not alone at the end of their lives the way I very nearly was myself. That is the closest thing to justice I could construct, and I'm going to take it. The 11 weeks it took to finalize everything were the strangest of my entire life. There was no glee in it, not once. I ate dinner with my son and daughter-in-law repeatedly. I held my granddaughter on my lap while, at that exact moment, an architect I had privately hired was sitting in a parking lot outside a title company 2 towns away. Every night, I walked back to the guest house feeling like a man watching a wave come in from a long way off, already knowing precisely where it would break and on whom, having made a deliberate decision not to shout a warning. I slept better during those 11 weeks than I had in the previous 3 years combined. Before any of the paperwork on the house itself was finalized, there was one other thing I did first. In the very first week, I sat down with Diane, and it is, without competition, the best money I have ever spent in my life. I set up an annuity for Rosa, a real one, funded monthly for the rest of her life, along with health coverage, regardless of whether she ever worked another another day for anyone. It did not require a single person to lose anything, cost me a fraction of what the house was worth, and corrected something that had been sitting wrong in my chest since the day she called, worried about me, hours after being let go over text. She still works at the foundation's building now, as their residence manager, entirely on her own merit. She's the one who shows new families around when they come to look at a room for a parent they don't know how to care for anymore. Now, back to the house itself and the letter. Diane was extremely clear about how this needed to be handled. We are not ambushing anyone, she told me. We are going to give proper written notice, well in advance, with a clear date, delivered in a way we can prove. Not because the law requires us to be kind about it, because I am not going to have anyone able to say afterward that you were sneaky. Everything we do from here, we do on the record. In the first week of July, a certified letter went out to my son at that house. It stated plainly that ownership had transferred to the foundation as of the closing date, that the foundation was granting him and his household a courtesy occupancy period, and it gave a specific unambiguous vacate date. He signed for it. We have his signature, and here is what my son did with that letter. Nothing at all. He told no one, not his wife, not her parents, who were, at that very moment, under contract to sell their own house further north, based on a plan that depended entirely on a property that no longer legally belonged to anyone in that family. He decided it must be a bluff, that he would drive over at some point and have a conversation with me, and it would get sorted out the way everything in his life had always gotten sorted out for him, quietly, by someone else's effort. He never came. It may be the single saddest sentence in this whole story. My son received a certified letter informing him that he was about to lose a $12 million house, and he did not believe it was worth even a 20-minute conversation with his own father. Instead, he waited, and while he waited, doing absolutely nothing, his in-laws sold their house. The 5 weeks between the certified letter and the confrontation in the foyer reveal the most about who all of us actually were underneath everything else. Nothing outwardly changed. I still came up to the main house most evenings, still sat at the same table, at the head of it now instead of where I used to sit, since that seat had quietly become my daughter-in-law's without anyone announcing it. I still held my granddaughter, who was 2 years old that summer and beginning to talk in real sentences. She had started calling the guest house Grandpa's house, distinct from the main house, and every time she said it, something complicated moved through my chest, because a 2-year-old had already, without anyone teaching her to, correctly identified which building belonged to which person in her family. My son and I talked about ordinary things during those 5 weeks. Baseball, a leak in one of the pool filters. There were moments when the old ease between us surfaced again, briefly, the way it used to before the money, before the erosion, and in those moments I felt something close to grief for what we could have been to each other if I had simply been a different kind of father 30 years earlier. My daughter-in-law was, if anything, warmer to me during those 5 weeks than she had been in the 2 years prior, which I've come to understand as its own small tragedy, because I believe her warmth was genuine, the natural ease of a woman who believed her family's future was already completely settled. She had no idea she was being warm to a man who already knew exactly how that future was going to unravel. There were nights I felt something like guilt about that, watching her set the table, humming, utterly unaware, and I would remind myself of the conversation I'd overheard through a kitchen wall in March, of a text message that fired a woman after 22 years of loyal service, and the guilt would recede again, though it never fully disappeared. A certain stillness settles over a man once he has made an irreversible decision, and I experienced it fully during those 5 weeks. I already knew what was going to happen, down to the specific date. What I was actually doing through those ordinary dinners and baseball conversations was saying goodbye to a version of my family that had already secretly ceased to exist the moment that certified letter was signed for. I have asked myself many times since whether I should have said something during those 5 weeks. I had spent 3 years being the one who absorbed every small humiliation quietly, who let each erosion pass, rather than risk being the one who made a scene about it. For those 5 weeks, for the first time in my adult life, I was the one who knew something the rest of the room didn't, and I discovered I was not, in the end, a large enough man to give that knowledge away for free. It came to a head on a hot Tuesday in the second week of August, 5 weeks and 2 days after the certified letter had been signed for. I had a genuine reason to be at the main house that morning. The foundation's project team had come out to walk the property ahead of the closing, and I was meeting their project manager. There was an architect on the front lawn with a clipboard, a survey crew near the seawall, and I imagine, from my son's perspective, seeing all these unfamiliar people scattered across what he'd spent 2 years believing was his property. Something in him finally decided the moment had come to end whatever he'd been telling himself this was. He came out into the front hall and asked me, with an edge in his voice I hadn't heard directed at me in years, what all these people were doing on our property. I told him they were with the foundation, and he said the thing that I believe he had been building himself up to say for 5 weeks. Ever since he'd signed for a letter he'd decided not to believe. Dad, we need to be straight with each other. This has gone far enough. Harold and June close on their house in 3 weeks. They're moving in here. This is theirs now. And then, with a coldness I had genuinely never heard from him before, not once in 39 years, he added, honestly, at this point, don't ever show your face here again unless you're invited. My daughter-in-law had come out onto onto the stairs to watch, the way she always seemed to appear whenever something significant was about to be settled between the men in that house. She laughed, not a large laugh, a light one. The particular kind of laugh you allow yourself when you believe the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. "Barrett, come on," she said. "You belong in a nursing home, not a palace." I looked at the two of them standing there in my own front hall, my son and his wife, and here is honestly what came over me, which isn't what most people expect to hear. I did not feel triumphant. I already knew with complete certainty everything about to happen to all three of us over the following 11 days, and I took no pleasure in that knowledge. Instead, I felt tired and enormously sad, and something close to pity, because I understood that I was the only person in that hallway who had any idea what was coming. I understood something else too. I could still stop it. Right there, 4 sentences would have been enough to prevent everything about to happen. I could have told them the truth, and Harold and June could have kept their house up north, and my son could have kept believing for a little while longer that the world always sorted itself out in his favor without consequence. I did not say those 4 sentences. I have examined that decision more carefully than any other of my life, and here is honestly where I have landed on it. I did not stay silent to punish them. I stayed silent because I had finally, at 68 years old, stopped trying to manage the outcome of my son's life for him. He had been handed a certified letter with a specific date on it, and he made a choice about what to do with that information. For the first time in 39 years, I let my son find out without any intervention from me exactly what happens to a man who decides not to take something seriously. I still don't know, even now, whether that was the most loving thing I have ever done for that boy or the coldest. Some days I believe it was one, some days the other. I no longer expect that question to fully resolve itself. So I smiled, nodded, said, "All right." I picked up my hat from the front hall table, walked out through my own front door, got in my car, and drove back to the guest house, and I did not raise my voice a single time. 11 days later, 3 moving trucks came up the driveway. I was there that morning because the foundation had asked me to be for a small ceremonial part of the process that had been on the calendar for weeks, entirely unrelated to whatever schedule Harold and June were working from. Did I know they were closing on their house around the same general time frame? Yes. Did I know it was going to be the exact same morning? No, and that is the honest truth of it, though I won't pretend I was sorry when it turned out that way. The house that morning was full of people who had every legal right to be there, and none of whom Harold, June, or my daughter-in-law had ever met. 6 people from the foundation, including their executive director, an older woman with silver hair, an architect, and 2 contractors with drawings spread across the dining room table, the same table where my son and daughter-in-law had once planned my future over a bottle of wine, a project manager in a hard hat, Diane in a gray suit with a folder under her arm, and a deputy from the sheriff's office standing near the front door, present at Diane's request, an ordinary precaution for situations exactly like this one. And there was me, sitting in a chair by the window in the front hall wearing my hat, since I'd just come in from outside and hadn't thought to take it off. The front doors stood wide open for the contractors carrying equipment in and out all morning, so when the family arrived, nobody had to knock. They simply walked in, mid-conversation, the way you do arriving at a place you believe belongs to you. Harold came first, June just behind him, and behind both, my daughter-in-law, with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a set of keys in the other, talking about which room would make the best sitting area, her voice carrying easily into a front hall that had suddenly filled up with strangers. They stopped almost immediately, and it happened in stages. First, they registered the number of people, a dozen strangers, hard hats, drawings spread across a table where their own furniture was meant to go, a man in a sheriff's uniform by the door. June said, "Oh, sorry, are we," in the tone you use when you think you've wandered into the wrong event. Then my daughter-in-law's eyes found me, in the chair by the window, in my hat, in a house I'd been told 11 days earlier I would never be welcome in again unless invited. I watched her face do something complicated, because the man who was never supposed to show his face here again was sitting calmly by the window, as though he had been waiting for her, which in the truest sense, I had. And then she saw the plate on the wall. The plate had gone up 2 hours earlier that morning. Brushed bronze, freshly hung on the wall of the front hall, catching the light in a way that made it impossible not to notice the moment you walked past it. It read, in simple lettering, "The Eleanor House." Underneath, in smaller type, "Respite and Transitional Residence. Eleanor, my wife." Her name, permanently mounted in bronze on the wall of a house her own daughter-in-law's parents were, at that exact moment, in the process of moving into. I was watching my daughter-in-law's face when she read it, and I want to describe exactly what I saw, because I have replayed it in my mind more times than almost anything else that has ever happened to me. Her eyes went across the plate once, quickly, the way you read something you expect to be unimportant. Then they went back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly, the way a person reads something when the words refuse to assemble themselves into a sentence that makes sense on the first pass. The Eleanor House, my husband's dead mother's name, on a bronze plate, on the wall of a house my parents were, at this exact moment, moving 3 trucks worth of furniture into. The order in which understanding arrived for her is what did the actual damage, and I want to lay it out carefully. She did not read that plate and think simply, "We have been cheated out of a house." That thought, on its own, might have been survivable, might have produced anger without producing collapse. What she read instead, standing in a doorway with her own parents directly directly behind her and their old house already sold and gone was proof that the entire situation had been settled, finalized, and physically bolted to a wall in permanent bronze letters, and that the process of finalizing it had clearly taken considerable time. Bronze does not happen overnight. Bronze requires weeks of lead time at an absolute minimum, likely longer. And if it had taken weeks, that meant someone had known for weeks. I watched her arrive at the end of that particular thought while she was still standing on the front mat, coffee cup in one hand, keys in the other. And that is precisely the moment the keys slipped from her fingers. The keys hit the marble floor, loud in a room that had gone otherwise almost completely silent, and nobody moved to pick them up. Not Harold, not June, not me. The sound seemed to hang in the air of that front hall far longer than any sound reasonably should, and I have thought many times since about how strange it is that a single object hitting a floor can somehow contain, inside its own small noise, the entire collapse of a family's understanding of its own future. Harold was the first one to speak. He turned to his daughter, his voice low and careful, the voice of a man trying to understand something before he allowed himself to react to it. "What is this?" he said, and that was the exact moment my son walked through the front door behind them, having parked further down the drive to make room for the moving trucks. He did not need anyone to explain the plate to him. He had known about that letter for 5 weeks. He understood everything, all at once, standing in his own doorway, watching his wife and his in-laws discover in real time the thing he had decided 5 weeks earlier not to believe. Diane stepped forward then, calm, unhurried, the folder still under her arm. She introduced herself to Harold and June as my attorney, and explained, in the same measured tone she used for everything, that the property had transferred to the foundation in June, that written notice had been given well in advance and signed for by a specific person on a specific date, and that she had copies of the relevant documents with her, should anyone wish to see them. She had brought copies. Of course she had. Diane never came to anything important without a folder. My daughter-in-law turned on her husband, her voice rising for the first time that morning. Signed for? What is she talking about? Signed for. My son did not answer her. I watched the silence stretch out between them, long enough to become its own kind of answer, longer than any sentence he could have said instead. "You knew," she said, quieter now, and somehow that quiet was worse than the shouting would have been. "You've known about this." Still, he said nothing. His face had gone the particular gray color of a man watching every excuse he might have offered evaporate before he could even attempt to use it. I got up out of my chair by the window then, and I crossed the front hall, and I picked her keys up off the marble floor because she was shaking too badly to bend down and get them herself, and I held them out to her. It seemed like the only decent thing left to do in that moment, whatever else had happened between us. She took them from my hand without quite looking at me, and I said the only thing I said to anyone that entire morning. "There's a good facility not far from here that takes new residents. Your mother's welcome to apply. We keep a waiting list." I do not know even now exactly why I said it. I have wondered many times since whether it was cruelty, dressed up carefully as a courtesy, or whether it was simply the truest sentence I had left in me after 3 years of silence. I suspect it was some measure of both, and I have decided I do not need to fully resolve which measure was which. June had begun to cry quietly near the doorway, one hand pressed against her mouth, looking at a house she had just sold her own home to move into, a house that had, it was now clear to everyone standing in that hall, never belonged to any of them at any point in this process. Harold stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing at all, his eyes moving slowly around the front hall as though he were trying to physically locate the exact moment things had gone wrong. My son stood in the doorway behind all of them, still silent, watching his wife's hands shake around a set of keys that no longer opened anything that belonged to either of them, watching his in-laws absorb the sudden and total collapse of a plan they had rearranged their entire lives around. And I believe, in that particular moment, watching his own father stand calmly in the middle of the wreckage, he finally understood something about who I actually was that 3 years of quiet permissions had allowed him to forget. I put my hat back on. I did not say anything further to any of them. I walked out through the open front door, past the moving trucks, still idling in the driveway with their back doors hanging open, past the contractors carrying equipment in the opposite direction, and I did not look back once.